What I thought I would do is kind of go back 10 years. I have no idea why there's a voice coming out of here. Must have been Liza. So I'm going to go back 10 years just to kind of give you a 10-year timeline, because this effort did start in 2013. I started working here in 2012. And at the time, a few people had come in and were concerned about stormwater flooding, was what they were calling it, nuisance flooding. And so we started looking into what could be done, where could we start? I will tell you, in 2012 and 2013, there wasn't a whole lot of money. There wasn't funding. Nobody really was even looking very hard at the problem. And even when we received our first bit of assistance, they came to us and they said they would talk to us about stormwater, but they could not talk to us about tidal water. I remember it very clearly because we had a room full of people that were part of this new task force that were going to look at our problems. And I took a bunch of pictures that I'd been gathering from 2012 to 2013. I put them on a table and I said to the people that were there, and there were people from the state, there were people from NOAA, some engineers, some stuff like that. And I said, you pick out this stormwater flooding and separate those from the tidal water flooding, and we'll talk about the stormwater. And of course, we all know there was no way to separate them. And they said, well, how would you do it? And I said, well, I took the pictures, and if there's droplets on the mirror of my vehicle, that was stormwater flooding. And if there's not droplets on the mirrors of my vehicle, that's tidal water flooding. And that was the first time that the state started to think, okay, there is not a clear separation for these waterfront communities, especially a peninsula community. It was a good 4 or 5 years later before they really admitted it. And so now clearly, when you talk to the state departments, the funding departments, the state highway, any of them, we no longer separate it. It's now just called climate change and sea level rise, because really stormwater flooding and tidal flooding is basically climate change and sea level rise. So Oxford was a big proponent in teaching the rest of the government in the state how we were going to look at this going forward. And it was really important for money, because money is the only thing that gets the infrastructure built. I'm going to go through this PowerPoint pretty quickly. I don't expect you guys to read all the language, but there's a reason it's all on there, because we will put this on the website for the town. And then at your leisure, you can actually sit down and step through that timeline. And that way, if you see something you want more information on, you have a way to look for it. And a lot of it is actually on the website too. So let's see if we can get everything work. Oh, we got there. So in 2013, we started with asking for help, and we had attempted to get some money from the state for assistance. And what they told us was they weren't ready to help us. National Fish and Wildlife wasn't ready to help us. And they offered some for assistant. They call it task assistance, and they give us an assistant. And what they did is they came in and they helped us do a stormwater flood management financing study. Back then, it was solely based on how a community could fund their own study and fund their own infrastructure, which all of us knew in the end would not work, but it was a start. So in 2013, we actually had a series of meetings. They went all summer. We had about 6 meetings. We had discovery meetings up at the town meeting room where different communities could come in. So everybody from Jack's Point was notified to come in for Jack's Point and talk about the problems in their area. And we did this in 3 areas in town. And then we set up a series of educational programs that were in the park. They were on Oxford Day. They were up in the town meeting room. And it was really kind of get everybody in the community on board with, we need to start looking at something, anything but something. 2015, we had taken what we learned in the 2013 study, and we went found engineers that would work with us and develop mapping. So what we needed to know was a complete inventory of our stormwater infrastructure and a complete inventory of our shoreline infrastructure, which is not something anybody really been cataloging ever in the past, but to know what to do going forward, you needed to know what you had on the ground. With that mapping that we paid for in the town, we approached the state and we were able to get funding to develop what we call our Stormwater Management and Shoreline Protection Master Plan. It's an extremely large document that's extremely boring, but engineers sat down and looked at all of our issues and problems and prioritized or identified them. So one of the key components in moving forward with infrastructure improvements is the money isn't always where you want it to be to fix what you want to fix. So you quite have to go where the money is. So if money's available for certain projects, that's the ones you do. It'd be great to just say, we're going to do them in the order we need them. The reality is you're going to do them in the order that they can be funded. And so that has driven a lot of what we have done. And this plan sets up all the things we probably need to look at. So whenever somebody says, oh, we're offering money to do culverts, we can quickly go to that plan, pull out sections that need culverts and say, oh, we planned for it. You cannot get funding for infrastructure unless you already have planning in place and hopefully design. And that was a big holdup with a lot of infrastructure funding. So that's the purpose of these developments. The point I want to make is every year we've tried to look at something and move forward with a project. These first starting programs made a difference. While we were doing those studies, we kind of became noticed at the state level and at the university. So University of Maryland contacted us and said, you know, we're real interested in the study you just did. Could we do a project with our students? And the student projects are a great discovery for Oxford. They like Oxford because we are a goldfish bowl and they can just throw the kids in here and they can go around and do projects, go back to their schools and do what they're going to do. But what it leaves us with every time they do it is plans, designs, ideas. Things from the minds of students are always different than our minds because we are pretty set in our ways and we have a hard time really going, oh, well, let's go try this crazy out of the box idea. Students don't. They just look at things and they have great ideas. I show you this plan because it looks remarkably like our conservation park. If you look at the mapping, you see the stormwater pond. This student was tasked with what to do with the runoff from the farmland, because at the time when this person looked at this, it was just farmland. And we realized pretty quickly when the farms under heavy rainfall, which is one of the problems with Oxford, is these extreme rain events, that the farms could not drain properly across the culvert they were supposed to. They were hitting the Oxford Road and they were rushing down to the causeway. And that was amplifying our flooding on South Morris. So this student was tasked with what could you do to slow that up? And this was their concept. And I only think it's important because it became very useful. In 2014, Talbot County invited us as a town to participate with them in the design of the conservation park. And they asked us to put together a group of people, and the commissioners at the time put together a small group. Tim was on that group, Jennifer Stanley, Peter Dunbar, and one other town resident that'll come to me. And then there were other people from around the county. They had engineers. I believe GMB, interestingly enough, was involved because that's an engineer we used in and out, but it helps us to have people familiar with Oxford. And when we went into that meeting, we walked in and we threw this on the table. We said, whatever you're going to do with that park, we think it should manage the stormwater problem. I think if we really hadn't pushed that right away and didn't have this already done, we may not have got what we ended up with. I will tell you an interesting story because Tim will remember this well. We tried to tell them that when there was tidal flooding, there would be water in this field. And they assured us that they did not have to worry about tidal water coming back into the pond they would build. That was not physically possible. They had looked at it and would not happen. And once this park was built and this was dug out and ready to go, I'll never forget the first phone call because there was total panic. It had flooded with tidal water. Of course, we're all like, okay, told you so. Hope you picked the right plans. But that we learned two things. Number one, you can have all the engineering and studying in the world. Don't discount what you know and what you think you know, because what we think we know is a really important information. We knew that the tidal water would go in there and we see it happen all the time. They've had to adjust to it. But again, the effort that got us there is how we ended up with Conservation Park. We all love the park, but it serves a major important step for us. And that was taking all that stormwater. That's a lot of stormwater off of 90 acres from the causeway. Following up on that, in 2015, again, after the state had approached us, we started to get approached from the federal government, and NCOS had called and said they were going to try to do a vulnerability study. We were one of the first ones they did in the country. They did town of Oxford and Talbot County. And what they wanted to do was determine whether they could look at what was on the ground, the people, the housing, the income levels, the minority groups, all of these things in one study against sea level rise and climate change, and see what the impacts would be and how you could address them. So it was their first effort at a federal level to figure out how to look at that in these communities. They've come a long way since then. But for us, it produced another document that we have in hand that we can use when there's an opportunity for us to say, hey, what you're doing could help us. We have these studies. I actually ran into one of these women. We had a walk around town, and she goes, we're looking back at that first study we did, and they're still talking about it compared to what they do today. So again, us being the goldfish bowl that people are willing to come to makes us a place where people are willing to bring funding. The second group we were approached by was actually the state, the Critical Area Commission. So in your zoning, you have critical area regulations, and your regulations for critical area have always looked at how to filter stormwater to protect the bay, because that's the purpose of critical areas, is to protect the bay. They asked us how critical areas could help Oxford, and our response from the planning and zoning perspective was, you tell us to plant trees, and we really feel like we could use help with stormwater on the ground. The tree buffer idea in the critical area was to have tree buffers along all the waterfronts. Well, we have houses on our waterfront, so these tree buffers do not do what they're supposed to do for the farmland. So our regulations, after they did their study, and it was actually supported by NOAA, they were able to make some determinations on what could help us. And we were one of the first communities in Maryland to adapt our critical area regulations with the state to meet our criteria. So now, unlike many communities, if you want to build a shed or a small garage or something, you still have to provide mitigation. It used to be you had to provide mitigation when you build a whole house or you developed a subdivision. But in Oxford, if you want to build just a small little shed, you're required to at least come up with a rain barrel. There's levels of mitigation for every effort. The second thing they identified was our tree coverage. Tree coverage in Oxford is one of the best things that you have going for you, because it does a couple of things, but one of the things it does is it holds an enormous amount of stormwater. So our stormwater flooding is the amount of water that hits the ground. So if the longer you can hold it in a pond, on a tree, any place before it hits the ground, it gives it time to run off. So the trees matter. They're beautiful. We love them, but they serve a stormwater purpose along with a lot of other environmental purposes. So they adapted in our critical area regulations in the whole of the town. So critical areas is 1,000 feet from the water. Every place in town, except for a small little part of our public works department, is 1,000 feet from the water. So every place in the town of Oxford, we have a 1-for-1 tree replacement policy. So if you want to take down a substantial tree, then you have to replace it. And if it's a big tree, then you have to replace it with 3 trees. That too was designed just for us within these regulations because they realized we had a need. So it was important that we worked with them in this fashion in order to get things that were important. People come in all the time and they get their permit and they don't want to meet all these requirements and they think some of the mitigations are ridiculous. What's great about ours is they can serve a purpose right here in their own backyard. And so that's the important part of that. Following that, going back to one of those 2013 designs, this is one of the other student designs we had from the University of Maryland Landscape Architecture Studies. And this is your Causeway Park. So this student was tasked with, what do we do with the stormwater at the causeway? Because they were all looking at the same flooding. And interestingly enough, this will start to look familiar too, no different than the conservation part. But his interpretation was, we had discussed how hard it is to elevate and build a bridge there, and that's a whole different topic. But his idea was, if you let the water in and let it out, you can curb the flooding that we now deal with as far as nuisance flooding in the causeway. And it has to have a place to go. And this is an ideal place. Does anybody know why it's an ideal place? Because it wasn't always an elevated park. It was a marsh. It was really where they were putting the dredge spoils when they would dredge the creek. And so when you take something like that away from nature, nature doesn't like it. And she's going to just push back on that piece of land for a very long time. And we know that. But this design, we took it to the state. The state has this someplace in their files. And we said, please put us on your list. We need you to look at this road. But we also took it to the DNR Coast Smart portion of the state and said, hey, we really need help with these ponds. And this is not something infrastructure we can afford to build. I applied for a grant from this one department 2 times and got nowhere. And I was sitting in a meeting in Ocean City with the head of that department. And he stood up and told a room full of people from municipalities all over the state, said, if you need help with your stormwater, just let us know. I was across the table. I said, now, wait a minute. We have been. So he gave me a phone number. He said, call some people. So we did. And what we were able to do was to get funding from a program called the Watershed Assistance Grant Program to design something. Because at the time, you could not have construction funding unless you had design funding, and design funding for stuff like this is between $50,000 and $70,000, and we didn't have design funding. I contacted that program. We were able to get the funding fairly quickly, and we went to a design to look at these stormwater features. And basically, this is the soccer field, if you can see the mouse. We had a little ditch over here, and everything drained through a ditch that ran down here, ran across here, and ran straight out. And what would happen when that gate was closed is it just started filling up, and plenty of you seen it. Eventually the tennis court gets covered over, South Moore Street, and it just became a whole lake. The students called it Lake Oxford because it could happen overnight. We received the design through the grant, and we went back to that gentleman who sat across from me at that table in that meeting. And we said, okay, here's our design. Here's our third chance. We were asking for a grant, and we put in a request, and we were successful. It was a $650,000 project, and the state provided $600,000 for it. It was one of these situations where they were going to look at stormwater and tidal water at the same time, even though that was against everybody's rules. And they were going to allow us to build these stormwater ponds, realizing that we had to stop the stormwater from going into the creek in a fashion that did not flood this area when the tides were high. So what happens is the stormwater from the backside of the farmland to our east hits a pond here, slowly goes through bioswales here, eventually it crosses the road, comes through the back. There's actually an underground pipe that you can't see, comes out in the fairly substantial bioretention area that runs down South Morris, eventually goes under another pipe, comes to here, and goes out a tide gate. Most of that you don't see happen because a lot of it goes up and under the ground. But this slow process was a huge difference. The people that live on Pleasant were quick to say instantly. It was like overnight somebody turned the spigot off and they didn't see the problems they had been seeing up till that point. The other area was back here behind, let's see, where we got community centers over here. So I got to really get my orientation. That neighborhood right there. All this drainage goes into a pond on that side. That pond takes a similar track, comes down this way and meets here. So all of this is really a circle. We added some stormwater storage where the old ball field was, because at the time this was too rushing into these ditches. And as soon as the water rushed into ditches, it has no place to go. So adding this in is another method of slowing down what comes off of that field. And again, the whole process is to slow it down. It's called stormwater retention, bioretention. It's going to be a method that you'll have to incorporate in Oxford more and more as time goes by, because you will need to manage the stormwater when the tides are high. And we know the tides will be high with sea level rise. Which brings us to our next big project. And I will tell you in this timeline, which is what would be nice if you look at it online, you'll see all the other things we've been doing over 10 years. I'm trying to hit on the big ones that are kind of current, so people are asking more about them. This is the Strand. We requested design funding, not just for this part of the Strand, but for the whole north end of Oxford. So the request was to protect the whole north end of Oxford. And a lot of people came in and said, well, that's not our biggest problem. We have a big problem at, over in Bachelor Corner. We have a big problem over at, Bondfield, and you're not looking at the big problem first. Well, that year, Governor Hogan came out with a plan. His plan was he was going to provide you money to design, money to construct, and money to follow up. And because he realized at the time you couldn't do all three. You struggled to get a design, and then you had to find construction money, and then you would hit a wall if you needed to monitor, because all your funding requires monitoring. So his program was 3-tier. Because we'd already done our study, we didn't even need the first tier, and it popped us right into the second tier. because we had done our studies through them and because we had created those stormwater ponds, they came to us and said, we think you should be one of the first communities to go into this plan because you're already at stage 2. So we applied for design of this beach. Why this approach? Because this money suddenly became available. And it isn't going to be there forever. I don't think you can get it right now, to tell you the truth, but it was available, and that's why we started. What it promised us was 90,000 for design, and they would help to fund the construction. Didn't have an amount. Didn't know what it would cost, but they would help. So it was a promise to go forward. Why is this part of Oxford important? If there's nobody in the room that's living up at this point. So everyone thinks if anything happens here, it only matters to these guys. And I hear it all the time. This is really not everyone's problem. Well, your infrastructure for these guys runs right here along the edge of the west side of the road, between the road and the water, and takes care of them. Everyone else in the historic district is in the same system. So if there is a breach in the water and sewer here, everybody in the historic district of Oxford will be impacted. If a sewer line is busted, that's major. You have one pump station in the historic district that pumps all of the sewer out. If something happens, you have a major problem. So protecting the north end of Oxford is not going to stop flooding, but protecting the north end of Oxford from an encroachment into your infrastructure is important to the town. And I say these things so people understand how we got to the steps and why we're looking at it this way. I don't know if everybody does this. I know I do. Bet Tim does. When something's going on, you go out there and look at it. So I just want you to see this is not a storm, no raindrops. It is a heavy wind and a very high tide. And this is the impact. This is this high wall that we don't think the water is going to come over. This is further down at our weakest point. This is the backside of the parking lot of the Strand. And when we turn around, you'll see the water's already crossing the street. So this is basically the opposite of the first video. This is the north end. You can see that it's breaching across the beach. And this makes us a little nervous. And then we get right here. So here's your infrastructure. Here's your water, sewer, electric, telephone, whatever you got done. It's all right here. If this crosses through here and takes out a pipe or takes out a road, we are all seriously impacted. And how far up is our problem? Well, it reaches pretty far up. That right there, when I'm standing there taking these videos, was making me darn nervous. And I could tell you on this day, I wasn't even in my own truck. I was in a bigger truck, because once this water starts to come in like that, it's pretty quick and you find yourself sitting in it. So your infrastructure that runs all the way up, you can see it's been breached, what, 4 times now. First one I showed you, the second one, this is the third one, and the fourth one's right here. If this were a hurricane, we could have an island pretty easily. And it was an island, yes, sir. And what I just tell you about the Causeway Park, Mother Nature hates when you take stuff. She wants it back. This water almost always crosses across this parking lot and exits out the other side. And that's important in your design because you have to take that all into consideration. See if I can get into the next slide here. We'll get there. So why are we looking at living shorelines, and why are we looking at the quote unquote marshy islands, marshy spots in the water? Because they, for Oxford, have been effective. And a lot of people do come to Oxford to look at our living shoreline, especially the one at the ferry and the town park, because they actually have been very effective. We have some of the few living shorelines that are in the public's view. They are generally not. They are usually on private land or federal land, and people don't see them. Ours are visible and the public can touch them, and people can come study them. What they do is they create a situation where you're still going to have the waves, you're still going to have the high water, but you don't have this. This is the erosion that we see at the yacht club. When you get over here, what you see is a living shoreline, and it's quite a while before that water breaches it. And even when it does, all of this has broken the wave action down. So now it's just water lightly coming over, which we can manage. That's a very well designed and a functioning living shoreline. I'm going to show you the opposite of this one, and that is on the right side of the ferry where we don't have a shoreline. We have a little bit of weed growth, and that's it. How does that matter for us? This is what happens in the same storm and the same waves on the opposite side of the ferry. It's already started to come into the parking lot. There's nothing slowing it up. As the wind picks up and I get down to the far end, this got really crazy. I didn't even have the pictures, but at that point, when I came back from the other videos I just showed you, the water was over the ferry dock itself, which you don't see, the F dock, which sits next to the ferry. The water was coming up through the slats and running off that dock. It was real, and it was not a storm. It was just extreme wind. So the point being, the living shorelines, they're functional for this north end, and that's what prompted the design. One of the requirements, and we told the state clearly that we wanted to protect this area, but we did not want to give up the public beach, because you can go back in the Oxford records to the very first regulations and laws. And one of them was there would be no nude bathing on this end of the beach, which that was ironic that there was nude bathing that long ago, and it was a problem, and they had to actually write a law. I always think of when you read laws in other communities, there's things like you can't throw your wastewater out your second floor window, but in Oxford, you can't nude bathe from the north end. I think that means you were allowed to on the south end. That's my guess. But anyhow, we told them that's our historic public beach. The town didn't want to give it up. The residents didn't want to give it up. So we wanted it to be there. So in order for us to maintain a public beach that isn't right on top of our infrastructure, they'll push it out in the water. They will build a further beach. The whole living shoreline will push out into the water. The green, lime green area that you see is basically the quote unquote grassy strip. It's not a knoll, it's just a strip. But that's where we would be walking. It's kind of where we walk now. It's where we would walk in the future. And then there will be a dune. We had at one time put out stakes so you would know how high the dune was going to be. So there was a visible means for the people that live on the strand to say this is where the dune is going to be. The last stake has been removed. The public, I guess, needed those little 1 inch by 1 inch sticks. I'm not sure, but it was there about a month ago. And then the last tour I took people on, it was gone. But anyway, the people that were living here at least had that opportunity to have a visual, know what they would or wouldn't see. The islands were another major concern, and they're not really islands, and you won't be able to put a tiki bar on them, and we weren't going to name them after anybody, although there was a thought to have a contest to raise money to get your name on these things. But they're just marshy points, and the whole purpose is simply to slow up the wave action and direct the waves differently. So this is all designed to reduce wave action on this fragile area of the town, to add sand back so we continually have sand filling into this beach, because right now what you have is it get washed up, it gets washed out, it comes in, it goes, and eventually it will just not be there. And these will be mostly underwater most of the time. They won't even be that visible. You'll just see grasses. And you've been to areas in the wetlands where you just see grasses. So that's what we'll have. This extends from just, let's see, what is that? West of Norton Street. And these hooks are to keep the sand on the beach. And it goes up to about the entrance to the marina up north here, including this private property. One of the things that was attractive about this funding is they didn't have a hang up on whether it was public or private property. And when we're looking for grant funding, we always pay attention to that, because in reality, Oxford is going to have to protect all of their shorelines. You can't just protect the ones the government owns and think that's going to protect the town. You've got to hit everything that is not already stabilized in some fashion. This design will also include an elevation of that roadway. It won't be a tremendous elevation, maybe 2 foot, but it'll have cobble under the asphalt. And what the cobble will do will allow the stormwater to actually flow under the road, as opposed to over top where it now sits and even puddles anytime you go down to the strand. This grassy strip, which will be lower, will also be able to run off, because we all know that it's going to go off the back end, because that's where it's always gone off. It's going to keep doing that. On the back end, they will improve that to be another living shoreline with a whole different type of infrastructure. This asphalt will drain into a filtering pond before it actually goes out into the creek. So we're not having street runoff go into the creek. And there will be some type of a pedestrian access into the waters for kayaks and stuff like that, because we don't want to remove our public access to the water when we do these designs. That's just a small snapshot of it. There's more in-depth design for this, but I just wanted the public to have an idea what it looks like. Let's see. Can't remember if, yeah. So when you visually look at it, it'll be from about here. You can see that. It'll run down to about here. So basically this area will just be pushed out and there'll be a dune. It'll start on the rocks and it'll run up in front of the current wooden bulkhead that sits across from the parking lot. One of the things we were able to convince the state that they have not done in the past is most living shorelines remove all the hardened infrastructure and then they build the living shoreline. And they have a preference for that. And the contractors have a preference for it. We were able to convince them that we are building this for bad weather and heavy waves, but we always have to remember that, you know, nobody thought Sandy was going to do what Sandy did up north. And if we were to get hit by a hurricane, we want that cement and the rock and everything that's already there to be underneath whatever they build. So in the worst case scenario, if your living shorelines are destroyed, you still have some backup, and that's important. So they eventually came around to understanding we didn't want to take out any infrastructure we already had. So everything will be in front of it. And that just gives us a little more time going into the future for protection. It's almost at the end and we go to questions. So this is just a kind of a real quick glance at how this works. The bottom right corner is your cobble bed under the road. This is your grassy strip, which I said when the rainwater falls there, it's going to drain back out this way. This is a dune planting that then eventually goes to the sandy beach. There will be some type of a cross to get over these dunes. We can design it any way we want, but we're thinking it's more than likely going to look like wooden decks, kind of like when you go to the ocean and you walk over a little wooden overlook to get out, because you can't really just walk over them. If we allow people to continue to walk over the dunes, they will simply become soft sand and go back where they came from. So we will have entrances. There's supposed to be 2 of them to get to the beach. The beach will meet the water like it does now. And the difference is it looks to be about 100 feet. We'll have these marshy breaks out in the water. They're close enough to the water that they won't interfere with what we currently have out there in the way of moorings or the boat traffic or anything, but they're far enough away that they will slow the wave action down. In the areas where there's not a sandy beach, it'll be more of just the road, the grass, a dune, and then we'll go into the water and you'll have marsh grass. There are breakouts for a lot of these, and I'll try to get some of them up on the website, but this gives you an idea of the main area, which is right there at the middle of the beach. And we started looking at this when they told us we were going to get money from the government. So ARPA, American Rescue, what is it? I can't even ever get the words right. American Rescue Plan Act, we just call it ARPA, was funding. So what the federal government decided to do after COVID to kind of kickstart things, but also to provide some money for construction to the country, they gave every single municipal and local government and Indian reservation and any other entity in the country pot of money. They had some secret formula that none of us know because none of us could figure it out. And you got a dollar amount. And the town of Oxford's dollar amount was like $594,997 or something crazy, but it's just under 600,000. It was to go directly to the communities. We were able, because ours was not a very big amount of money compared to what everyone else got. I think we're talking millions and millions in Easton and in the county. But ours, we could pick, they originally came out and said it could be for water or sewer, and it was pretty specific. And sadly, that amount of money wasn't going to do a whole lot for water and sewer. But we held out because they kept thinking there was something they were missing. They'd pick up on it eventually, and they did. And they added stormwater. So the 3 main uses that you could use this for without a whole lot of hoops and a whole lot of other paperwork was water, sewer, or stormwater. Because we were working on wastewater and we were working on water, we took this directly to stormwater. We went out to bid, and we've got an engineer who is currently doing an investigation of 2 areas of Oxford that are known for their flooding. The Tillman, Mill Street, Norton Street, Stewart, area has some serious problems. They are impacted by stormwater flooding because it can't get out. They're impacted by tidal flooding when it breaches and comes in. And what we want them to do is look at our infrastructure and tell us where we start and how best we start to manage it. We know that the 300 years of infrastructure we currently have is not going to carry us into the future. It barely manages now. The second area is Bank Street. A little more obvious how it gets in, comes right over the top. You can stand there and watch it come in the door and it fills it up. The stormwater, on the other hand, drains backwards from South Morris to Bank Street and fills up because the one tide gate we have is closed. So again, they're going to try to figure out what is the best way to manage this. Won't be the same as the Tillman area because it's actually a totally different problem. Still stormwater, tidal water meeting, and how do we get it back out? The second area of importance, and if anybody was here in October of 2021, this area was totally unreachable, even by foot. I tried it and well, I'm rather short, but it was waist high. I remember standing out here and having a resident yelling at me and telling me the stormwater failed. And I remember saying, this isn't stormwater. This is all tidal water. This whole area was completely really inundated with tidal water that did not come from the causeway. It came from Pier Street, came into our system, and we are still investigating how it actually gets in because we have tried to block this tide gate. I don't know how many times we've tried improvements. We tried a lot of things. What we do know is there's a lot of oyster shells under this road. This whole thing is probably, who knows how deep in oyster shell, very pervious at this point. I stood right here in this parking lot, outside the parking lot on the street, that little parking strip by docks, and watched it coming up out of the curb. There was a crack in the curb, and I'm watching the tidal water come up. So we know something's not right. We know the water meter pits fill up with stormwater, with tidal water when there's a flood. So they're going to investigate where it's encroaching. And it may very well be that it just comes up from the ground like the Beverly Hillbillies and oil. It's just coming up. If that's the case, then we're going to have to figure out how to mitigate that. In this area over here, we have the same problem. We're getting this stormwater. We know part of it is coming in here. I mean, the tidal water. But one of the things we discovered by accident is the stormwater that the citizens thought was tidal water is actually stormwater coming from down this road. It forces its way all the way down this system with such pressure that it shoots up out of the storm vents when you get up here. So everybody says the stormwater is coming in. I get called, come down, it's coming in, you can see it, it's shooting straight up. We accidentally discovered that it was coming from the lab end, and there was just so much pressure because we get so much rain, it's so much at the same time that there's more pressure than we've ever seen, and it actually shoots into these storm drains and fills up this area because it's too much pressure to work its way back out the tide gate. So they're investigating these two areas. Two problems that are probably going to have to be mitigated with the same type of solution, which will be pumping. I think that you are going to have to start pumping this, and it may be that this pumping does not try to go back out this way, but actually goes up to this series of ponds and out the causeway, because trying to get everything back out through this tide gate is very difficult. This pump station, in my mind, I just imagine these things. That's why we have engineers that will have better answers, but it is very possible this tide gate probably needs to go away. It gets breached too often. And instead, we would have an exit without an entrance. So most of your stormwater in Oxford goes out the same way the tide comes in, because that's how it works. It's all gravity and it goes out. This tide gate gets breached often, and when it does, this whole area fills in with water. So the objective would be to be able to send the stormwater out without having it come in. And the best way to do that would be to have a pumping station that pumps that tide, that's tide water and the stormwater, because both of them are going to be a problem, up and over that bulkhead back into the river. It's done in Rehoboth Beach or Dewey Beach. There's a couple of beaches that have started doing it on the Atlantic Ocean, and everybody goes, well, that's not doing good. It's going right back in the same water it's coming out of, but they still do it because they're able to pump it out as it's coming in until the tides go down or the storm goes away. And that keeps the flooding under control. I think you're going to see that there, and I think eventually we're going to see that here. But keep an eye on this area because it comes up later. And here it is. So this was the view you saw at the Oxford 2100 presentation. The point of this timeline that you kind of just got a glimpse at was to show you that it's taken us 10 years to get to this point. 10 years of the studies, discoveries, infrastructure improvements, infrastructure recommendations. This is what potentially Oxford would look like in 80 to 100 years. It's not a perfect science. We have not focused on the science. I leave that to scientists as to when and how sea level rise, climate change, et cetera, will have this strong of an impact. But we know that there's an impact because we can see it with our own naked eyes in our generation. And that's what's really important to us. This is based off of the sea level rise expectations that were assigned to us by the state of Maryland. There is a study, I think I have it on the website already, but they came up with their numbers. And so any money that you spend of theirs, they tell you to use their numbers. And that's pretty much what we're sticking with for this study. And I can't put numbers to it right now because I didn't bring them. But basically, this is the expectation where you see blue for there to be water in Oxford. The reason I made such a big deal out of that prior areas for that matter, is there's the Causeway soccer field, very possible. Nature's going to take that back. And she's probably going to work her way over there. So we're trying to figure out how do people continue to live where they're living? How do we continue to have Oxford? When I first talked to this department about doing this study, they were pretty adamant about everybody should just move. That's pretty much the way the state began to look at sea level rise. And if you're from Dorchester, this isn't even funny to them because that's what they've been told. There was no funding for what we wanted to do, which is be here. And my argument to the state was, we've been here 300 years successfully, and we plan to figure out how to be here another 300 years. Unlike a lot of communities, Oxford serves a purpose for the whole state of Maryland. And that's how we presented ourselves. We are, first of all, an actual artifact. We are a museum. You come into Oxford and you see something you don't just find anywhere. And it's important to try and maintain that element. And that kind of got us in the door. The other thing was, we've been working on this for 10 years. We are willing to do what you think we should do. We just want to look at how to move forward. And the young lady, look at that, Liza's phone's going off. I wonder if she knows it. The young lady that did grant us this money in the end, I'll never forget it, because whenever she talked in the meeting, she would say, and Oxford has chosen to shelter in place. And that's what she calls it. She calls it, our plan is shelter in place. Everyone else's plan is retreat. So what we present to Maryland is the opportunity to focus on an area that doesn't want to retreat. And can they be successful? And this is important to the people that are in the resilience committee, the people that are here when I'm gone. Always maintain that theory, because that's how you're going to get the state to help you with your infrastructure. It's hard to justify, why should we put all of our state money into a tiny little town when you 500 homes could just move inland? Look at all that farmland. You need to always be on the front, on the outer edge, pushing the envelope, saying, we are your test case. We are your goldfish bowl. Try things here. It's not going to all work, but it sets you up for success moving forward. And it may not be us, it may be somebody else, but we have to continue to pass that information on. That's the purpose of the study. It's a little overwhelming when it hits you in the face and you look at it, you go, my house is in this water, and these people have definitely come to talk to me. Interestingly, the designs we saw without a whole lot of context were really kind of just an impact. The idea was to let the public know we are looking at something serious, but we're still talking 80 years. We're still pretty sure none of us are going to physically be looking at it. But we want to look at it for the future and for the future residents of this town and for your children when they get your homes. That's why we're looking at it. One of the things they proposed in the design, because all I've seen is the first draft report, which I pushed back, especially on this one element, was all these brand new floating homes in these waters. And I said, you know what? That's not how evolution works. So you don't just wipe it out and build another community each time something changes. You adapt. And that's what we were doing in all the slides I just showed you. And that's what we've been doing for 300 years. So we want to adapt. So when we take homes, which we're looking at elevating some of these homes, and we bring them up to 8 feet, well, we want that adaptation to matter. At some point, we want to be able to say, and when you elevate a home, you build a foundation, it's a block foundation, and those homes get completely disconnected, set up on some pilings, they build a foundation, they set them back down. So we should be planning for a future where we build a floating pier, dock, platform. I make Tim do these things all the time in his mind. He's like my go-to for these ideas. And those houses we've been elevating, why can we not put them on these platforms and adapt them to this new method of receiving their utilities and their water and sewer? And so those are the things I pushed back to the designers and said, I want you to rethink this. I don't want to see new floating houses in the water. We want to see evolution in that water. We know the water's coming, but how do we evolve our community? And it's happening all over the world. I get emails from Mr. Kearns all the time. Look at this. My favorite one was the one he sent me, and it's probably been almost 8 years now, of a house that have their boat tied up to their dock. They just lifted it up and the water was under them. And when they left every day, they got in a rowboat and left. But these are people that are thinking. I mean, that's what they're doing. So this is what we're doing. How do we adapt? How do we maintain? We'll probably lose 10, 20% of the community because you're going to just lose it. But how do we stay where we are? Floating structures is going to be one of your answers. It's not just Oxford's answer. It's going to be the answer all over the world. And some communities are already doing it because they're already at a point where they have to figure out how to live where they're at. And there won't be more land. There will be less land. There will be more people. So floating is going to be an answer. And it's good that we're looking at the concept, because that allows us to start thinking in the next 20 or 30 years of the type of infrastructure you will need to reach that sort of a concept. This recommendation has a multitude of different mitigations. The shoreline protection that I gave you a little more detail on is probably going to be useful in areas where you don't have any other options. And if you want to maintain some of that shoreline or that water access, you're going to have to start looking at building these living shorelines, which pushes the water back and gives you some protection. In other areas, it's not going to be that easy. And one of the designs they came up, which is on the back side in Town Creek, was the proposal that you're probably going to be looking at a seawall. This is something I liked, that they presented multiple means of addressing this on the same diagram and the same kind of plan for 2100, because everybody says just build a seawall. Well, you can see if we were just going to build a seawall to protect the town of Oxford, it's going to have to start down here at the state road, and the wall is going to have to go completely around this town and meet back here at the state road. And then we will be living in like a living moat. And all we'll have around us is a giant wall. So that's not feasible. It just isn't feasible. This idea, though, of taking your marinas and putting them on the outside of a seawall and having your houses protected by a seawall on the inside in these areas where we already have this working waterfront and need to maintain it is a whole new concept, and something that between our architecture designs and our engineers, they've been working on. So this study, which people, look at as like, well, it's just kind of a panic and what are we going to do, is actually kind of evolving into these are things we need to investigate further. And then we will get people's attention when we make these suggestions, and they'll want us to investigate them. So the purpose of this study is to really, it's a way of looking at things. It's an exercise like you would do when you were in college. Everybody go do this exercise. Tell us what you got. We are actually acting like students, and we're doing an exercise to see what the end results look like. And then we will try to adapt them to what we need. So the next 5 years, just as a real quick, here's where we're at. So we're part of the community rating system, which is a higher regulation from FEMA, which means we push really hard when people want to bring in building permits, and the public doesn't particularly like it. But to tell you the truth, if you're building a new house and you're not building for this problem, for sea level rise, well, then you shouldn't be building a new house in Oxford, because you are just going to be one more problem in the future. So we now require everyone in the special flood hazard area to meet 7 or 8 foot of elevation. And that's from the base, that's the base flood elevation. Our base flood elevation averages at 4 or 5 feet. Isabel was about 6 feet, a little over 6 feet, someplace in that. So that already tells you why everything flooded that was in the flood hazard area, because it was below 5 feet. And we want our houses to be at 7 or 8. So Isabel was the worst case scenario for Oxford, but it doesn't mean it's going to be in the future. It will eventually be overshadowed by something else. 7 or 8 feet for your first floor should be a minimum for us. It should also be a minimum for us in the whole town. So I propose to the citizens, because the citizens will really have to drive this one. It's hard enough for me to enforce regulations we've adopted. It's difficult to suggest a really strong regulation. I think that all homes that are built in Oxford or substantially improved in Oxford should be at 8 feet, and it should be across the board. We should just have what they call a flood protection elevation of 8 feet, period. That buys you 50 to 80 years, and that's important. So as you're evolving, replacing your houses a few at a time, again, you're evolving into a higher level of first floor housing. And that's what you need to do. Or you end up where you just wipe out everything and build in all new houses. And so evolution is what's going to get you where you want to be. I strongly think that this zoning is one of the areas we need to look at, but the public has to buy into understanding why it's important. No one wants to spend the money to elevate their home. But if we don't continue to elevate these homes, and I mean the homes that aren't in flood hazard areas also, you will have issues. So to explain that on a flood map, you have a flood area, and it's everything that is under 5 feet. Base flood elevation in the town of Exford. Everything that's under 5 feet is considered a special flood hazard area, and you must meet flood regulations. If you are on a piece of grass that is 5 feet 1 inch, you don't have to meet that regulation. If there's a flood at 6 foot, the guy who had to build his house at 8 foot is watching the flood. The guy that left his house on the ground at 5 foot because he didn't need to do anything is now underwater. So this is where it's push come to shove. If you guys do not increase your zoning ordinances to adapt that standard across the board, you are not preparing for the future. You're not preparing for the next generation. The second thing in the next 5 years is this resilient shorelines. Build the strand, see how it functions, start picking your next areas. Your pocket parks, your street ends are probably the first places of we should be looking at, because they're the first places that are impacted during storms in the whole of the town, unless they have a bulkhead. If there's a bulkhead, we need to start looking at putting living shorelines in front of those bulkheads to reduce the impacts on the bulkheads, because the bulkheads are only good as long as they're stable and lower than and higher than the water. But as that water increases, you're going to have to do something to maintain that. So that would be the step. And the other thing is these shoreline improvements need to be on public and private land, because if you're not looking at the whole town, you're not addressing the problem. If your neighbor's the only guy that didn't worry about it, doesn't have a bulkhead and didn't do a living shoreline, and you are up here and he's up here, it's still going to come in. It's still going to flood the streets. It's still going to impact the town. Stormwater and tidal water management, we will take the engineering that comes out of the ARPA money, and we will spend every penny till the 600,000 is gone, but we will take those plans and we will go to DNR and we will start hitting them really hard for infrastructure improvements. By then we will have spent all the money on the strand. We won't have any open grants with them. And that's the time to start your next steps. And you tell them, we did all this work. We're ready now. Here's our plan. We want to take this federal money that was given to us to create jobs and start doing construction. So you're setting yourself up for the next steps. The water improvement project, which is the big town infrastructure project that's starting on your water system, your drinking water, is relevant because resilience is resilience of the community, not just resilience from sea level rise or resilience from climate change. It's economic resilience. It's resilience of your ability to manage yourself and feed yourself and have stormwater and have sewage and have drinking water. So these improvements are important. Our wastewater treatment plant is already elevated at 8 feet. It is already out of the special flood hazard area and still elevated at 8 feet. So the town is on board with this concept. That buys you a lot of time with that plant. It also has some other safety features built in. The wastewater is something we can secure if we secure that north end. The water system we're currently looking at, and we need to look at that for a lot of different things. The Morris Street, the main water line, we actually relined that. If anybody remembers, about a year ago over Christmas, we had some fancy stuff going on. And that was really us convincing the state and the contractors we could do what we did in the winter. Everybody remember the orange blankets that were everywhere? So the public we were ready to do the job. The state said, you cannot do this, but you cannot do anything with water lines. They're going to freeze above ground. You're going to have to hold off. And we were like, we can't. We want to do this right now. We don't have any tourists. We don't have our summer visitors. Everybody's wherever they are in the winter. We want to do it now. And I called the contractor and I said, we were joking about using pipe warmers to keep the water from freezing. I said, but what about blankets? And he goes, you know what? I never thought about it. But what about cement contractor blankets? So when they pour cement in the winter, they put contractor blankets over it, and the heat the blankets create allows the cement to set. So that's what those were. We took it to the state. Our engineers convinced their engineers that it would work. And that's how we did something that had not been tried before. That water line, though, now has been lined from the inside out. It meant we did not have to dig up the 1960 pipes that were under the road. We basically created a better pipe from the inside, and that will be long-term. So that water line is fairly secure. So you don't have to worry about intrusions to that for the time being. The rest of the system we want to look at, the wells, the quality of our water, questions about salinity. So other communities are definitely seeing some salinity in their aquifers. These are all things we want to research, and this should be done while we're doing the water improvement. The last thing that is relevant over the next 5 years is the Community Resilience Committee. Tim is here. Oh, way in the back. I have my computer glasses on, Jody. So Jody is here. Kurt is out of town. They are part of this resilience committee that was originally established because Gordon Frank was concerned one day I wouldn't get up and come to work and I wouldn't have this information, but now it's in a timeline, everybody can go get it, but we wouldn't have this information in one place. So the idea is there will always be a group of people, I call them monks, they're the keepers of the light, that will have this information, and they will pass it on to the next members of that committee, and they will pass it on to the next members of the committee. The job is to keep it going forward if we want Oxford to be here in 300 years. So that's the task they've been assigned. They also, in their job description, was to be available when we needed somebody to review something or answer questions or look at projects. So they will be real soon reviewing the report that goes with the Oxford 2100 project. Once they've reviewed it and given their comments, it will be put into a formal report and presented to the commissioners of Oxford and the public. So they will have a really good idea what's in that report once they've had to do that review, because that's their job, to keep the information moving forward. And hopefully this concept of a committee will move forward forever, because that is going to be your monks, keeping those books in one place. The Oxford 2100 report and timeline. So I want you to understand that that report will produce a timeline. It'll be similar to one I just showed you, except that's 10 years going backwards. This one is going to be 80 years going forward. The idea is for them to identify the projects so that we can put them on a timeline and know that in 2030, we need to start looking at this. And in 2050, this needs to have happened. That's how the public will be able to move forward with how do we accomplish it, because nobody's going to come in and fix your town for 2100. It's just not, that's the big seawall, and that's not going to work. So you need to be able to figure out what steps you need to take. When you have this in a document and you go to the state or the federal government for assistance, you're way ahead of everyone else who's asking, because you thought this out so far and you have it for them. And that's the idea, is to have all this preparation. It's gotten us the first few steps. It'll continue to get you steps. One of the other things that we are doing that would help in this area, there she is, couldn't find my mouse, is we have applied for federal funding. We've never tried to do this before. It's earmark money. You go to your senators, you convince them you have something no one else has, and that they should try to fight for your money in your community because you're trying to get something no one else has. Usually it's big museums and stuff like that. In our case, we asked for funding to build capacity for sea level rise adaptation on the Eastern Shore, to be done in Oxford, to use the Oxford lab, the NOAA specialist, to start a sea level rise study at ground zero, which is what Oxford is. Oxford has places that are 2-foot base flood elevation. Well, when you look at sea level rise and 2 foot, we're the place to study it. We're one of the lowest points in the Chesapeake Bay that has access to the lab, to NOAA. NOAA does not focus on this currently. They're a fisheries location. They focus on a lot of things like what animals in the water have wrong with them, what's sick, what's not, that sort of thing. We're trying to combine their efforts with money from the government to do a study that will benefit the town and the whole of the Eastern Shore, because part of this component will be to take what we learned to all the other communities that are in the same situation as us. I didn't know how it would work. I spoke with members at NOAA. They got people involved from out of the state, from higher departments of NOAA, and everybody was kind of on board. We would make this approach. And we took it to Cardin and Van Hollen, and they sent their people down to kind of investigate. I don't know if you've ever seen me walking people through town. I've been doing it for 10 years now. And anytime you guys want to do it, we could have resident tours too. It's to show them that Oxford is doing something. And so they sent their people, NOAA sent people, and we walked around to show them we are doing something today. We are the place to bring your money and make a difference. We are in NOAA's budget for what is it? This is $3 million. I can't remember. I don't even remember the number now. It's been so long since I said it. But anyway, we are in the budget. It's to fund, I think it's $1.3 million. It's to fund 2 scientists and 2 citizen liaisons out of the Oxford lab, along with our own tide gauge that will give us real-time readings for flooding and weather. The scientists will be doing the discovery, and the liaisons will be bringing it to the community, one to bring it to Oxford, one to bring it to the rest of the Eastern Shore. So we've proposed a project that will study a problem on the bay for the state of Maryland. So we're hoping that they understand that. Keep in mind, Annapolis and Baltimore and Washington, D.C. are all on the same bay. So there's a reason to think this is a good idea for the federal government. We're hoping we get to the next level. I'm totally amazed where we are now. I really am. I never thought anybody pay attention. I thought earmark money, you just threw it out there and it never came back. So the fact that we are at this point is really important. I've asked them to let us know when we should be advocates so that the public would know when they need to go push this. Right now, we're just kind of in there. We're in there and we're hoping for the best. The last component that we want to focus on as we're working towards this timeline in the Oxford 2100 is, of course, the causeway. The causeway belongs to State Highway, and we need an approach from State Highway for that roadway. It has taken us many years, but we are actually prioritized now in Talbot County. And I think Katrina told me last time she looked, we were number 3 as county projects. And that's important because if you're not on the state's plan, transportation plan for your county, they don't pay any attention to your problems. We've tried the approach. Does anybody else have state roads that are flooding? And they just laugh because there are a lot of state roads that are underwater right now. Ours is not the only one. We see ours more often than we see what's going on in Dorchester or any place south of us. But we have the county understanding that it matters to everyone and that it is a priority. I'll be honest, it helps that the county manager used to be the emergency management director. So when you go to the emergency management director and say the causeway is flooding, we have a problem, which he was when it was, and we had a problem, his understanding is much better sitting in the county office. So we are on the county's recommendation to the state as one of the priorities. All we're asking for is design, because they are not going to walk in here and fix that with construction. In the way the state funding works on the state transportation plan, is you get your design and then they allocate money for construction, and it takes a while to get there. If we can get them to agree to a design and get a design in hand, that doesn't stop us from going and asking for earmark money now that we know what the process is, or anybody else for that matter. So that's the direction we're working with the state. So you hit everything where it needs to be and you just keep pushing. And that is the end of that. So one of the things I try to do, and we have to be out of here by 5 minutes to 7, so I've left 20 minutes or so, is answer questions. So does anybody have questions that I can now look at you in the right glasses and answer? Everybody will all of a sudden become very clear. I know it's a lot of information because 10 years is a long time to throw at you at one time, but that's why it'll be online so people can just kind of access it and then ask individual questions. Yes, Cameron.
Thank you. Not so much a question, but an observation. What you were saying about nature reverting to its previous condition, soccer field and the island in the Strand. I think of 1704 act on sheepskin, Parsons Museum. Look at that whole area of Bank Street, that's park. So that's starting to revert. I think thinking ahead 80 years, it's just as helpful to think
Yep.
back 300. Things will start to revert to how they were. That was aware that was said. Bill,
Yeah.
but I've heard some old stories about people doing bad things to the marshes
Yeah.
years ago. But anyway, very, very interesting.
So, I have a copy of that, and maybe we move that out into the main entrance too, is because we want to kind of work up a whole kind of demonstration, but you're right. And it's something I talk about when I do the tours, because that is one of the things we try to explain, because when people call and say, I'm looking at a house on North Morris, but I'm really worried about sea level rise. So your oldest homes in the town of Oxford are your safest homes, because 300 years ago, 200 years ago, even 100 years ago, when people came to a place from another country across the Atlantic Ocean, they wanted high and off the water, because that was important. They needed to be on the water because that was all their resources, but they were always smart enough. So you don't see a lot of these places. The oldest homes are nearly always more elevated. And then the community builds out. And as it builds out, it fills in. So if you go to Jack's Point, you have homes in lower areas. If you go out to Willow, Riverview, you have, and that's just how evolution works. And we need to kind of turn the tide. But that's one thing we always push, is those are the mistakes. So in almost all communities, they try to retrieve land, get more land, but you're taking it back from Mother Nature. Yes, Rebecca. Yeah, we still call it an island, even though it's not. Yeah. So if you look in the old pictures, which everybody should have that book at home, and look at those pictures, that gives you a really good clue. The Oxford, it's like just a picture book, and I use it all the time when I'm applying for grants, because I have one that's completely ripped apart, not even connected anymore, and I pull the page out and scan it in. So we call this the causeway out here, but I always say your causeway is at the end of the Strand, because that's a true causeway. It's where we've kind of taken an area that wasn't and made it a means to get to the other side. And some of the proposals, so we've had a second layer of student designs, and we're going to incorporate them into the Oxford 2100 report. And some of those students identify that as an island and have recommendations for, and these students really looked at 2100 as, will we need cars? Will we be flying? What transportation will we be utilizing? Will a passenger ferry, just getting those people from their homes to the mainland, be enough? 2100 wonders whether we get to Easton by ferry or not, because I was thinking of you. We don't know that Oxford will maintain its connection to the mainland, because there are other breaches between us and Easton. And we may be fixing our problem, but not necessarily seeing that corrected as quickly. So these are all things you have to think about. So the student designs will be incorporated, and they will be very interesting just to look at from their perspective, because they are not thinking about how much it costs or what it costs to pay for your mortgage or any of those things. They're just thinking about, wow, why would we do that when we can do this? So things will change. Evolution will change. Our parking will get better in the future because we won't have as many cars at some point. We can only hope. Yes, sir.
Thank Cheryl for forward thinking, because when I first began, one of the students in 1985 that came out of the cadre office at the University of Maryland, we designed the Maritime Museum shed that they now have. It's evolved over time. The same cadre designed the ball field, at a old warehouse. Did all this kind of thinking. So I would like to ask you to notice even the slightest little symptom of all of the things that are being studied, because we sat in front of the firehouse day after day and watched you flow our driveway to the parcel. You're not going through it, it's going that way, it's dirt. And that was one of the first hints of the whole cost area of the deal. With the conservation mark, getting the two together, solving the problem over here. I don't think that anything that you are noticing will go unnoticed. This is 10 years of development of people being interested to put all the facts together and make it.
You know, it's funny because people always talk about what the resilience committee should be doing or what this committee should be doing. And in my mind, I think the government has so many things going on anyhow. Oxford is such a small, tight-knit community. I think the citizens should start their own. You know, you guys should get together and have some type of a citizen community and committee and just focus on things and think about it, because it doesn't have to be the government driving the ideas. It really should come from you, but that's also a really good way to kind of talk through things, because that we knew that there was something not right, and we were told that there was no way that water was coming to the causeway. One of the things I started doing, which is how we've made some other discoveries. So one of the things we do when we're testing certain things is you can drop some safe dye into the water and wait to see where it comes out. It's not used for stormwater management, but we're using it for that because that's how we figured out that the lab was hitting the Pier Street instantly, because I told one of the guys to go get the dye, and he was supposed to bring it to Pier Street, and he misunderstood, and he dropped at the furthest storm gate up by the lab and dropped the dye in. And we're sitting there talking, he hasn't shown up yet, and the water's shooting out, it's a different color. So it's all like discovery. It's not as simple as just go fix that. And I think it's a good point, but I really feel like you could have some type of an event, or you could get together once a month. We have book clubs, we have all kinds of clubs. I don't know why you don't have a resilience club, honestly. And then just bring your ideas to us. Yes, ma'am. So this would be citizens just getting together and talking. So the one we have established actually feeds information to the government, and they serve a purpose. They maintain the government documents. Whereas I think a group of people that doesn't require the government staff to be there, for us to take minutes, for us to post notices, why you can't get together and just start thinking about things on your own. If everybody waits for the government to do it, you know how fast the government is. And they're just not. They're not fast. It doesn't mean the government stops doing everything they're doing, but I think this is a community of people that could enable themselves. And it's just a thought. You know, there are plenty of ways to look at it, and we can't change anything that we have to continue to do. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity for discovery and discussion. I mean, Tim and I can sit on the internet and look at these crazy ideas all over the world, which we do all the time now, but so could everybody else. And then gather your ideas. If you just keep throwing them at the office, well, we can't manage that much input, but you guys could manage it. And you have the resources, you have people that are in retirement, you have people that care, you have people that are educated. It's just a concept. It isn't, you know, it's how things get started, but it's a thought. Any other thoughts, topics?
We are one of the many jurisdictions that I was worried about all of this. And my wife's from Maine. I look at all those. I send it Tom all the. South Carolina has some problems. Venice, Italy has some problems. All over the world.
So I think it's South Carolina, it might be Myrtle Beach. One of the South Carolina towns adopted a flood protection elevation straight across. Everybody in the town has to build at a very high level, period. No questions asked. And that's something that I think Oxford should do. But if you, that's how you find these things out. You start investigating. But it's something that everybody can do. And the government will work as hard as we have been, but I think the public can serve a purpose too. Thank you. Yes, Lucy.
All right, so I think the engagement that is informed on their own creative thinking groups. Sort of important is that bringing this continuity over to the coordination of the town is doing and continuity of priorities that we carried on over different tenures of the different committees and commissions and commissions. So it's I think that's really critical. What is the thought about how we think this priority for this level of investment and then maybe over the next 5 to 10 years?
So, and that was my whole point is somebody has to continually drive it. You just have to continually drive it, and you have to be able to explain why you're going the direction you're going. And the Oxford 2100 is to give some direction to it. The point of the Resilience Committee is just to make sure that that information goes forward. I can tell you how studies work. They do the study, and you know this, Lucy, as well as anyone, and it gets put on that shelf, and we don't ever look at it again. In this case, these studies need to continually feed the next study, and you need to always do that. It seems like paperwork, and I realize that, but that is what creates the foundation to do the actual infrastructure, which is what you're going to have to address. So I think the Resilience Committee clearly knows that that is their mission. They are to make sure things move forward. Even if they only meet quarterly, they know that something has to happen next, or we need to identify something to happen next. I'm not going to be here forever. A lot of us aren't going to be here. Somebody has to carry it forward. The difference I thought with the citizen thing is it doesn't mean they couldn't provide information to us, but it pulls them out of the public meeting setting, the Open Meetings Act, the training that's necessary, all the public publishing, who can talk in a room together. It makes it so you can sit and brainstorm all you want without any criteria. And if you say bad words in your meeting, it doesn't fall under the government to slap you on the hand kind of thing. And I was just thinking there's an opportunity for the citizens, you know, to just be involved in something. And then when you think you really have stuff that's relevant or ideas or things you want to see, you send a priority list to the government. But it takes it out of that element of everything functioning like the government. Lucy can be in charge. Yes, Jody. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So yeah, so the starting point was kind of to get you guys together to because what I said is if you want to expand your mandate, so to speak, then you need to define how you want to expand it and then send it to the commissioners. The other thing you'll be getting, you might not know, is you'll be getting a draft of the report, which the three of you will be able to review and kind of give your feedback. So that Resilience Committee, they kind of work amongst themselves, their ideas. They have a place to bounce things off of each other, and then they can feed information back. But this was really a meeting to see, you know, how you guys want this to look going forward. And, you know, be cautious as to how much you bite off and how much you try to manage, because you don't want to drop the important part, which is maintaining this forward movement always. Yes, ma'am. Well, yeah. So one of the things that I've tried to separate what we're doing from what the citizens can and should do is how to address stopping sea level rise, how to address climate change. I think we all are educated in that field pretty much. What happens is if you take the science of why and what's happening and mix it with the science of how to mitigate what we already have to deal with, it gets really bogged down. So we've really been focusing on we need infrastructure. That's what I've tried to work on here and what the Resilience Committee is working on. Yes, there's a whole component of how we stop climate change, but the two together don't get a result. And you need mitigation. You need to address it because, like I said, in our generation, you can see it with the naked eye. Yes, we all need to do a better job at home. And that's kind of just a different element in a different group, and I'm not against working that, but I don't think if you put the two together, it gets tied up in the science, and we need to really be looking at the engineering. It's probably that simple. We got science, we got engineering, and all this focus is on engineering right now. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have a focus on science.
Nicely done, Chair.
You guys done? So Liza overbooked the room.
You never know what they do. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, she's okay.